In 1966, Carlos Marcello was the quiet king of the American underworld. He'd been boss of the New Orleans crime family since 1947, and by then he wasn't just running rackets, he was running an empire. At that table of bosses, Marcello was the richest man in the room. His syndicate in Louisiana alone was generating close to $2 billion a year, the equivalent of more than $20 billion today. Across the Texas border, his operations were pulling in another $700 million annually. The reach didn't stop there. He had cash moving through Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, South America, Europe, London, even Africa. His network touched men in the CIA and the businessmen who had built it. Men like Alan Dulles, and the corporate power behind them, like Sam Zamuri of United Fruit Company, the so-called godfather of American business. Marcello shook hands with the men who didn't just run the agency, they created it. Carlo Gambino was the other side of the coin. The quiet Don of New York. Cold, calculating, Sicilian to the bone. He carried the old world with him from Palermo, fused with the American cunning he'd learned from Luciano and the patience of Machiavelli. Gambino had known Marcello since the 40s, when they both made fortunes off the wartime stamp racket. It was a hustle born in the black markets, meat, oil, and everything else America rationed to fight the war. The scam reached through the Chicago outfit, with Santo Trafficante, Jr. in Florida, and Meyer Lansky financing from Miami. They were young men then, turning war shortages into gold. By the mid-60s, the old guard still ruled the board. In New York, the Genovese family remained the largest, the most disciplined, a global enterprise of quiet wealth. Officially, Vito Genovese still sat at the top, even if he was dying in federal custody. His loyalists, Mike Miranda, Gerardo Catena, and Tommy Eberly, kept his hand alive. Miranda was one of the few old-timers who could trace his path from the 1928 Atlantic City Conference all the way to the modern commission. He'd stood beside Luciano, done business with Lansky, and helped spread the rackets north through Boston, using United Fruit Fronts to launder money and move goods. He was an emissary between old and new money, between mob and corporation. At the Stella Restaurant in Queens that September, the bosses gathered. It was a meeting straight out of another century. Carlos Marcello came up from New Orleans, Santo Trafficante from Tampa, Carlo Gambino from New York, Mike Miranda from the Genovese side, Joseph N. Gallo, Gambino's consigliere, Agnello della Croce, his underboss, Joseph Colombo, the newly minted head of the old Profaci family, and from Florida, Dominic Joseph Alonghi, known as Fat Dom or Cokie Dom, president of a construction firm that once promised to build Miami's Colony Club before the money vanished. Alonghi was already flagged by a Senate subcommittee as a Genovese soldier tied to the bagel business shakedown in New York. Representing California's end was Anthony Carollo, Miranda's close friend. And from Louisiana came Joseph Marcello Jr., Carlos's brother and underboss, a man who handled the day-to-day in New Orleans, while Carlos kept his hands clean. The New Orleans syndicate was unlike any other. When people talked about the family, they weren't talking about 50 years of history. They were talking about 100. Their bloodlines went back to the 1870s, to the docks, the fruit markets, and the first Sicilian immigrants. The Matrangas, the Gaglianos, the Dequiners. They built a shadow city under New Orleans. The story began with Tony Matranga, the first Don who ruled the local Mafia with a council of 20 lieutenants. He was the boss when Police Chief David Hennessy was gunned down in 1890. After the acquittals, an angry mob stormed the jail and lynched 11 of the accused. It was the largest mass lynching in American history. The Matranga family's grip survived even that. Tony's brother Charles became underboss, and one of his lieutenants, Silvestro Silver Dollar Sam Carollo, rose through prohibition to become the new Don. Carollo ran New Orleans like a private kingdom until his deportation in 1947. He slipped back into the country more than once and died in 1970 at Turo Infirmary, but his influence never really left. His son, Anthony Carollo, would eventually inherit the chair decades later. In between stood Frank Todaro, a loyal lieutenant who took on a young street tough named Carlos Marcello as his protégé. Marcello married Todaro's daughter Jacqueline in 1936, cementing the bloodline. By the late 30s, another power from New York saw opportunity in the bayou. Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the Underworld, brought slot machines into Louisiana, cutting deals with Silver Dollar Sam and Governor Huey Long. Costello picked Marcello to open a casino in Jefferson Parish. It was the beginning of a partnership that would last decades. By 1944, Costello and Lansky were financing new gambling halls in New Orleans, the Beverly Country Club, the Southport Club, fronted by Marcello. He owned the casinos, the bookmaking wire services, and the politicians who made them legal. Marcello wasn't just a mobster. He was a businessman who understood politics. He didn't need to muscle judges. He bought them. He didn't threaten police. He promoted them. His secretaries became state officials. His lieutenants married into bureaucracies. His reach into Louisiana politics was so deep that he bragged on an FBI tape years later that he'd done business with 4 governors: Earl Long, Jimmy Davis, John McKeithen, and Edwin Edwards. He claimed to have paid McKeithen $168,000 over 8 years. McKeithen denied it, but Marcello didn't need the money back. As he told an informant, "No matter who gets in there, I'll find a way to get to 'em." In the 50s and 60s, while the feds were chasing New York bosses, Marcello operated almost untouched. The FBI office in New Orleans looked the other way, even as Robert F. Kennedy and the Justice Department pressed them to act. Marcello's power came from influence, not bloodshed. He moved through oil, real estate, and shipping. His lawyers, Irving Davidson, Jack Wasserman, and his allies in intelligence, former FBI man Guy Bannister among them, gave him access to Washington. His old friend Santo Trafficante ran Havana's casinos for Lansky before the revolution. Together they bridged organized crime, the CIA, and the shadow war against Castro. By 1963, when the Kennedys declared war on the mob, Marcello's organization was in position to strike back. For a century, they had corrupted everything around them: politics, courts, business. They didn't need to pull triggers themselves. They just had to let others do it. When Jim Garrison began his investigation into the Kennedy assassination years later, Marcello's name surfaced again and again. Garrison had once been close to Marcello's circle. Some said his inquiry was meant to muddy the waters, to push the blame toward the CIA, away from Marcello. By 1991, Oliver Stone's JFK turned that suspicion into a cultural earthquake. Even after Marcello's 1989 release from federal prison, the story didn't end. He'd been caught years earlier in the FBI's BRILAB sting, bragging about his influence, while federal agents recorded everything. Age and Alzheimer's had broken him by the time he walked free. The little man, barely 5'3", spent his last years on Grand Isle, playing cards on the porch and watching the Gulf roll in. He died in 1993. What he left behind was an empire without an emperor. Anthony Carollo, Silver Dollar Sam's son, reportedly took over the family after Marcello's death, edging out Joseph Marcello Jr. But the landscape had changed. The money was in legal gaming now, and the mob wanted in. By the mid-1990s, Louisiana and Mississippi had legalized casinos, and the same old names were back: Carollo, Marcello, the Gallianos, trying to muscle into the video poker business. Federal indictments came down hard. Carollo, Frank Galliano Sr., Joseph Frank Galliano Jr., and Joseph Marcello Jr. were all charged in connection with the scheme involving bally gaming machines across Louisiana and Mississippi. Anthony Radosti of the Metropolitan Crime Commission said it best. The New Orleans Mafia isn't dead, but these cases crippled them. Federal agents agreed. Will organized crime attempt to infiltrate legal gaming in the United States? The answer, unfortunately, is yes, said Neil Gallagher, the FBI's special agent in charge in Louisiana. New Orleans had always been easy for the mob. For a century, the city was their laboratory. They owned the cops, the judges, the mayors. There were no turf wars like New York, no Elliot Ness like Chicago, no Little Havana gunfights like Miami. It was the Big Easy, for criminals too. But by the 70s, the easy years were ending. A Life magazine expose and the steady grind of the Metropolitan Crime Commission forced Washington's hand. The FBI sent in Special Agent Harold Hughes, who hunted Marcello for nearly a decade until he caught him on tape. The conviction that followed stripped the little man of his last protections. The New Orleans Mafia had always been a family business in the old sense. Fathers, sons, brothers, nephews. Marcello's own brothers, Pete, Vincent, Anthony, Sammy, Pascal, and Joseph Paul, had all been involved. His closest associates, Nofio Pecora and Joseph Pareto, ran his wire services and front companies. Their wives, Frances Pecora and her sister, held government jobs, writing laws for the same men they slept beside. Frances would later serve prison time for bribery and insurance fraud. It was a system built on charm and quiet power. In 1972, a House Select Committee on Crime declared Marcello a formidable menace to the institutions of government and the people of the United States. They were right. He'd turned corruption into an art form. On the 1979 FBI tapes, Marcello bragged that he and his counterparts in Chicago, Kansas City, and Tampa owned the leadership of the Teamsters. His 30-year battle with deportation proved how deeply his influence ran. By the 90s, the names still carried weight, but the muscle was gone. Anthony Carollo's reign never matched his father's or Marcello's. The New Orleans mob was fractured, weaker, a shell of what it had been. The alliances with New York, the Gambinos, the Genoveses, were exposed and dismantled. The video poker scam was supposed to be their comeback. Instead, it was their last act. Yet the legacy of the Marcello syndicate is older than any indictment. It began with Sicilians off the boats in the 1800s and grew through Prohibition, World War II, and the Cold War, intertwined with business, politics, and intelligence. From the murder of a police chief in 1890 to the assassination of a president in 1963, the same bloodline ran through it all. Carlos Marcello once said that Louisiana was the easiest state in the Union to do business. He wasn't lying. For more than a century, the state was an open house for organized crime. When the rest of the country burned its mobsters in courtrooms, New Orleans just poured them another drink. Marcello's empire outlived him in pieces, some behind bars, some behind restaurants, some still moving quiet money through casinos. It was the oldest family in America's criminal history, born in the port of New Orleans and raised on politics, oil, and blood. And for one small man from Tunisia who came over as Calogero Minacora in 1910, it was proof that in America, even the shortest man at the table could rule the room. In 1966, Carlos Marcello had his back against the wall, which is exactly where he did his best work. Pressure made him sharper. War made him strategic. He looked at the fallout from 1963 and saw a botched job. Too many leaks. Too many roads that could run back to New Orleans. That meant strike first, control the narrative, and make sure anyone aiming at him felt the heat before they got their bearings. The first crack in the Warren Report didn't come from him. It came from Mark Lane, book first, then a documentary, which, for a time, kept Marcello's name off center stage. He knew it wouldn't last. After his 1966 arrest in Queens, and the punch he landed on a federal agent at the New Orleans airport, he heard worse news. The best-selling journalist Ed Reed was writing a new book on national syndicates. One chapter zeroed in on New Orleans, and, near the end, carried the first public account of a death threat traced to Marcello. An informant who later proved to be Ed Becker had taken it straight from the source. The scene was Churchill Farms, September 1962, on a road cut through the marsh. A black Cadillac rolled in. Marcello at the wheel, checked with a shrimp plant for the all-clear, then bumped along damp ruts to a plain farmhouse. Inside was the real office. A long, polished table, 12 black leather executive chairs, a bar's worth of scotch, and a boss who did not waste words. Small talk ran sex and money, then turned to pressure, law enforcement, Washington, and one name that hardened his voice: Robert Kennedy. The Sicilian oath came first: "Levarsi na petra di la scarpa," take the stone out of my shoe. Then the line everyone in the room understood: "Don't worry about that little Bobby son of a bitch. He's going to be taken care of." He had wanted payback since the day the Attorney General dumped him in Guatemala without a hearing. But the room also heard the logic: kill the Attorney General, and the President hunts you forever. Kill the President, and the Attorney General's fate is sealed. "Use a nut," he said. A year later, the President was shot in Dallas, 2 months after Robert Kennedy told the McClellan Committee he was expanding his war on organized crime. Oswald had lived and worked in New Orleans. He could have crossed paths with Jack Ruby, a former Chicago hanger-on, and the 5 lost days in Mexico left openings for contacts with displaced American mobsters. Many had motive to want the Kennedys gone. It's impossible to assert who organized the assassination without further proof. But the timing and the targets spoke for themselves. Marcello read the map. If the road could curve back to Louisiana, better to set fire to the government story first. That meant pushing the agencies onto their heels and keeping the focus on Cuban exiles, CIA crosscurrents, and the covert war, before anyone tied the exile circuitry to his side of the street. By 1968 and 1969, the exiles knew the Castro fight was a dead letter. Meanwhile, Marcello was back in country for good, no longer pestered by the brothers. Whether he kept his grip on the money machine, New Orleans, and the spokes running north, east, west, wasn't up to officials. It was up to the crowds who kept feeding his games in one back room while getting clipped in another. The popular story that took hold in the 1990s, after Marcello's death and after Jim Garrison died in 1991, left out pieces. Oliver Stone's JFK made the Garrison investigation a crusade. What didn't make the screen was how close Garrison stood to Marcello's world. He lived rent-free in property owned by a Marcello captain. He held $5,000 monthly retainers from illegal New Orleans casinos and $5,000 retainers from Las Vegas houses tied to Marcello's friends. In a 1962 NBC interview, and again when Life magazine went at them in 1967, Garrison called Marcello his political mentor and friend. The way it looked from Marcello's side, Garrison's probe launched, because roads might lead back to New Orleans, and because Robert Kennedy was eyeing 1968. If Garrison got out ahead with a counter-story, Operation Mongoose, Operation Northwoods, the CIA's covert games, it would drag the spotlight toward Langley and away from Barataria Boulevard. The path he dug ultimately ran to the Kennedys' assassinations. By 1995, more of that view was leaking out. Strip the legend and look at the record. Little man stood 5'3", but few underestimated him. The Metropolitan Crime Commission files and law enforcement say he was one of the country's major figures. The K-Forver hearings in 1951 put him on national television. He took the fifth, stayed cool, and drew the senator's anger. K-Forver called him an evil genius and floated public talk of deportation. Congress soon made marijuana sales a deportable offense, reaching back to Marcello's old case and starting a 40-year tug-of-war with justice and the INS. The McClellan Committee returned in the late 1950s, and Robert Kennedy, then counsel, marked his man. In 1957, Marcello's emissaries were at Appalachian, his brother Joseph Paul Marcello Jr. and Dallas-linked Joseph Civello among them. In 1966, Marcello himself was grabbed in Queens at the Stella Restaurant, Little Appalachian, sitting with Carlo Gambino, Santo Trafficante, and ranking Genovese, Gambino, and Colombo men. Life and Look hammered the state's mob politics nexus, and the Louisiana legislature held hearings in 1971. He did time 4 times. The last stretch ended in 1989 after 6 years, on convictions born from the 1979 Brylab sting and a California bribery case. His lawyer, Mike Maroon, always insisted he wasn't Mafia and took orders from no one. On the second point, even the Bureau agreed. After 1947, he answered nobody but himself. Harold Hughes, the FBI strike force chief who finally nailed him, said it plainly. Marcello ran people by charm and leverage, built friendships through legitimate fronts, and earned respect other bosses couldn't buy. New Orleans' status as the first established Mafia family in the United States helped. So did Marcello's personal grip. Born Calogero Minocor in Tunisia in 1910, he became only the third Don since the 1880s, after Tony Matranga and Silvestro Silver Dollar Sam Carollo. He died in March 1993. The line continued on paper under Carollo's son, Anthony. But the golden years were gone. The ground he stood on was built long before him. After Chief Hennessy's 1890 murder and the jailhouse lynchings that followed, the New Orleans mob learned to win without shock, intimidation, bribery, and politics. When Silver Dollar Sam shot a federal narcotics agent, a friendly judge handed him 2 years. That was the climate the young producers grew up in. He left school at 14, learned land and crops, and never stopped bragging on his green thumb. As head of Pelican Tomato Company, he rose at 4 in the morning to read real estate ads and spent profits on bars, motels, restaurants, and tracts that would become Jefferson and St. Charles suburbs. By his last prison run, he was pegged at $30 million in assets, built the smart way, he liked to say, by moving illegal money into legal ground. His first major arrest came barely past 20. 2 juveniles knocked over a grocery to raise gun money for a bank job he was plotting. With headlines calling him a Fagin, he drew 9 to 14 at Angola, where he learned how influence works. In 1934, he walked out on a pardon signed by Governor O.K. Allen at a legislator's request. He bought the Brown Bomber Bar, named for Joe Louis, where dice, cards, and marijuana kept the register busy. He opened a liquor store. Frank Todaro, Silver Dollar Sam's lieutenant, brought him under wing. On September 6, 1936, Marcello married Todaro's daughter Jacqueline. In 1939, after serving a year in the Atlanta federal pen for selling 23 pounds of marijuana to an FBI undercover, he took over the West Bank slot machine business for Frank Costello, who had brought one-armed bandits to Louisiana with Huey Long's blessing. Through Jefferson Music Company, Marcello and his brother Vincent planted 250 machines across Gretna and Algiers. He bribed police and deputies as a matter of routine. On Brelab tapes, he boasted he'd hand Chief Beauregard Miller Jr. $50,000 in cash every few months, stuffing a suitcase and walking it into the office. "I took care of everybody," he said. By late 1945, he, Costello, Dandy Phil, Lansky, and local gambler A.G. Rickafor opened the Beverly Country Club in Metairie. When Mayor Chet Morrison shut down New Orleans gambling in 1946, the crowds ran to Jefferson Parish and Marcello's count jumped. In 1947, the year he became Don, he and Joseph Pareto took a cut of the racing wire by seizing Southern News and Publishing Company, tying bookies statewide, and giving him routes into Houston, Dallas, the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and Mobile. He moved his family into an 8-bedroom Italianate mansion on Barataria Boulevard. In 1948, he and Victor Trapani paid $160,000 for the old Southport Club near the parish line. The casino's open run ended in 1951, when Sheriff Frank Clancy promised a clean-up to Key Forver. They closed, but the money already made had set Marcello for life. Then came the deportation. In 1961, Robert Kennedy ordered him dumped in Guatemala without a hearing. Within weeks, Maroon and Marcello were dodging through Honduras and El Salvador with cash in their city shoes. Maroon flew home from Tegucigalpa, and Marcello reappeared stateside under a cloud of speculation he'd hitched a Dominican Air Force jet. Trujillo had been friendly with U.S. mob bosses. Marcello never talked, and Washington never got him out again. The hate for the Kennedys hardened. November 22, 1963, turned into his double red letter day. Dallas erased his two enemies from power, and a jury acquitted him on illegal re-entry. Davis and others later mapped possible ties to the 1968 RFK killing in Los Angeles. The federal heat cooled under Johnson, and after Robert Kennedy left justice, Marcello couldn't afford another Kennedy administration. Aaron Cohn's Metropolitan Crime Commission stayed on him in the late 60s and early 70s. It got teeth in 1971 when the FBI sent Harold Hughes to run a dedicated task force. Hughes introduced himself by walking unannounced into Marcello's office. He kept doing it for 8 years, showing the boss he could be reached any time. In 1979, Joseph Hauser recorded meetings as part of Brilab, catching Marcello talking kickbacks for state insurance. A New Orleans jury convicted him in 1981. Later that year, the California case landed. An attempted bribe of a Los Angeles federal judge, an art lover, with a $125,000 Gauguin on behalf of 5 L.A. defendants, including Dominic Bruglia and Sam Ciortino, a cousin of a Marcello lieutenant. 17 years on paper. He served about 7. Released in 1989, he was an old man with the early edges of Alzheimer's, playing cards, lunching with his children, and driving down to Grand Isle. Sometimes he'd help at his son's tomato business. He had always said that was his only job. The paper trail from those middle years stayed messy. After La Stella, Queens prosecutors made him bleed money. Maroon remembers meeting an assistant district attorney, there named Ferraro, Geraldine, who would later run for vice president. In 1969, Marcello took a federal assault conviction for the airport punch and did 6 months at the medical center in Springfield. He came home 40 pounds lighter. The old arguments over whether he was in or not in the Mafia didn't matter to the numbers. The New Orleans family's status came from age and from him. The commission didn't give him orders. He built his own table and filled the chairs. By the 90s, the game changed. Legal gaming arrived on the Gulf Coast, and the same surnames tried to burrow in: Carollo, Marcello, the Gallianos, just as federal indictments in Louisiana and Mississippi came down in the video poker cases. The watchdog said it crippled the remnants. The truth is simpler. From Churchill Farms to the Beverly to Brilab, Carlos Marcello adapted, survived, and learned when to hit and when to hide. When he felt the wall at his back, he didn't crumble. He moved first. He shaped the story. And for a long time, that was enough.